everybody, it is Dr. Z. We are still talking about Italian fascism in our section on dictatorships, and we will be focusing on the economics of Italian fascism and some of the social issues as well at the time. One of the main things we have to remember is that fascism is capitalist. It defines itself against communism. And industries in Italy in the 1920s had a position of privilege in return for state support. This ensured the dominance of capital and the control of labor and professional groups. For example, there are no unions. Workers were not allowed to strike. This made factory owners quite happy. The state reorganized its iron and steel industries, launched a bunch of public works projects like highways, and they also rearmed after World War I. Your book says that Italy was not actually totalitarian because of its capitalism. I tend to disagree with that viewpoint because of all of the social aspects, but also because the state controlled the economy. And folks that feel nostalgic for fascism in Italy tend to say, like, Mussolini made the trains run on time. There were a lot of highways that were built, as you can see on the map here. But also cars like the Fiat Topolino. Topolino means little mouse, and it kind of looks like a little mouse, right? But that's one of the Fiats that were built at this time, and, you know, that people started to have access to. One of the things, though, that is key to Italian fascism is its desire to rebuild the Empire of Rome, right? So they conquered Libya in 1911, and then to make up for the embarrassment from the Battle of Adwa in the late 19th century, Mussolini went and invaded Ethiopia using poison gas, aerial bombing, horrific massacres in different towns and villages. And this is something that was not really well known in the historiography until later on in the 20th century, when the archives were finally sort of uncovered, the Rai archives. That's kind of like the BBC in Italy. And that story itself is quite interesting. But what comes out of it is that the fascists had built concentration camps in places like Croatia and on different islands in the Mediterranean for political prisoners, for foreigners, homosexuals, people who were seen as outsiders to the state. And the Italians also deported their Jews to the Nazi concentration camps as well. So their legacy of imperialism is definitely a very negative one that was recognized by the British and French when the Italians invaded Ethiopia. They sent a very strongly worded letter saying that they should cease their operations. Mussolini, of course, said no need. And he went and signed what was called the Rome-Berlin Axis with Hitler, who supported his invasions of Libya and Ethiopia because they both shared the same ideologies. So this document was called the Pact of Steel. So it's a pledge of friendship between the Italians and the Germans, and says that they're also going to help Franco, who's the fascist dictator in Spain, and during the Spanish Civil War. At this point, Italy withdraws from the League of Nations. They start to ban Jews from their civil and military employment. They do start to export their Jews to the Nazi concentration camps. Mussolini backs Hitler's incursions into the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and Mussolini also invades Albania. And so in 1939, when they finally sign this like formal agreement, the Pact of Steel, it's a pledge of friendship that includes the support in any offensive or defensive war. And now Italy then is militarily bonded to Nazi Germany. Mussolini was in an earlier video I talked about him as a master manipulator. He was very good at propaganda, and he had a very strong control of the press. The press only showed positive things that happened. So, you know, murders, car accidents, things like that were not shown in the press at all. Like, they were not published. Only good news was published. And when Mussolini would give a speech at a rally, there would always be commentary afterwards, but the fascist state sent the comments on themselves. They did not allow the press to write their own comments on his speeches. Likewise, the Italians were very focused on getting the foreign words out of their everyday vocabulary. They saw these as anti-Italian. They wanted to increase the idea of Italianness or Italianità in the state, and in their everyday culture. So, for example, like if you ask for a cocktail today, every bartender in Italy will know what you're saying. But they said, no, you can't say that word anymore. Now you have to say the tail of the rooster, coda di gallo, right? And then the idea of the Southern question or the mezzogiorno, this was banned as a word. You can't allude to the idea that the Italian South is backwards or economically dependent on the North. They also nationalized their cinema, and a lot of the press releases and a lot of the newsreels would be shown in the movie theaters before the movies so that people could see them. But the cinema itself, they created the Experimental Center of Cinematography, which took over Cinecittà. Cinecittà is sort of like Hollywood in Rome. And the films that they put out during this period were called white telephone films, right? You see a nice bougie lady with her fancy white telephone. Everything is beautiful and wonderful, and all the values of the fascist party were always shown in these movies, right? No violence, no un-Catholic values, things like that. The following pictures come from a book that my friend David shared with me a long time ago in New York City. And this was a book that Mussolini and the fascists in Italy had sent to Italian immigrant families in the United States. And the book explained fascism to these Italian immigrants, so that they would better understand the changes that their state was going through. And so what I saw in these books, and it's just such a wonderful treasure trove of resources, was a number of different things. So the first thing we'll talk about is the cult of athleticism. Here we have Mussolini driving a race car, Mussolini on a horse, Mussolini on skis, Mussolini on a motorcycle, right? Mussolini is being shown as a masculine, strong man who is, athletic and able. One of the favorite things during fascism was called the Dopolavoro. This is an after-work program. Think of kind of like a YMCA, like a cultural center for workers, where they could go after work, play cards, have a glass of wine or a beer, relax. There were exercise classes that would happen there, and they would be in these very fascist buildings. A lot of these buildings in this kind of simple but kind of ugly architectural style still exists in Italy today and have been converted into other things, like schools and whatnot. But they had exercise classes, right? After work, they had trips. So here's some folks from the Dopolavoro on a trip. These ones went to a snowy mountain. And, these are all the men sort of hanging out of their club, their after work outside club. And this was something that a lot of people really valued. They thought, wow, this is so nice that, we have this space for the workers to relax and enjoy ourselves. Meanwhile, the workers' children were in the kind of youth corps, right? The scouting program of the Ballila. And so the Ballila is akin to what we have in the United States, Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, except with the bend towards we are creating future fascist adults, future soldiers. One historian mentioned that they were basically creating, future cannon fodder. But young girls and boys would join these scouting groups that were named after different animals, and they, would be steeped and nationalized in their culture in this way. The youth, springtime of beauty, right? So here, this is in that chapter on the Ballila. Here we have Mussolini kissing these little, little scout children, right? The scouts would go and the Ballila would go and they would march in the parades that were required for everybody to attend. Mussolini says here, you are the dawn of life. You are the hope of tomorrow, right? And here's the Ballila. Notice the uniforms. One of my neighbors in New York City, Anna, she was a wonderful older woman, and she told me she moved to the United States right at the dawn of World War II. She claims that she was on one of the last boats to New York from Italy. And she was very poor when she lived in Italy. And she said the only new piece of clothing that she got was her Ballila uniform. And that she was so proud of being in the Ballila. And she loved her uniform because it was new. And it made her look like every other girl. And she appreciated feeling like she belonged to something. And so she felt quite a nostalgia for this as well. More propaganda from the Ballila. The small group is named the Children of the She-Wolf. You recognize the She-Wolf from the Roman tale of Romulus and Remus. And, it says the greatness of Rome is due to its eternal youth and its passion for the simple and sound things of life, right? So this belief in supporting families through the Dopolavoro, through the Ballila, also played a role in what the fascist state thought about reproduction. Basically that it was a couple's duty to have children. So Mussolini says a nation exists not only because it has a history and a territory, but because human masses reproduce from generation to generation. The alternative is servitude or the end. Hegel, the philosopher of the state, said, he who is not father is not a man. And so contraception was banned in the 1920s. There was a bachelor's tax that was given to single men who did not have families. Married men had preference for hiring and promotions in work. And the biggest, I think, contributor was ONMI, which is the National Agency for Maternity and Infancy. This was established in 1925, and it was established as a social service for women and children who fell outside of the normal family structure. Right? There were soup kitchens, nurseries, clothing, bedding. They allowed for paternity suits, so a unmarried woman could sue for paternity and say, you are the father of my child, you need to take care of this baby. They equalized inheritance rights, ended legal distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate offspring. So this was pretty huge, pretty radical, and pretty helpful in general if we think about some of these ideas. Also coming with it being the medicalization of childbirth as well. And they also created Mother's Day, right? So March 25th was deemed as Mother's Day. It's the day of the Annunciation. This is, honoring the Virgin Mary in the Catholic Church, and specifically honoring very prolific mothers. And so the story goes basically that at this rally in Rome, mothers who had lots of children would be called up to the stage to receive an award from the government, not by their name, but by the number of children that they had. So, 8, she would come up because she had 8 children. 9, she would come up, and it would go upwards of 12, 13, which was disturbing on many levels. With this, propaganda came the battle for births. And this was a reaction to a lot of immigrants leaving and going to places like the United States and Argentina and Canada. And they wanted to increase fertility. So they hoped to increase the population by 1/2 before 1960. So they subsidized matrimony, marriage. As I mentioned before, fathers with larger families, they got higher wages, they got preference for jobs. And they also, the most prolific mothers were made honorary members of the Fascist Party. They gave loans to newlyweds that they only had to repay if they didn't have enough children. There's the bachelor's tax that I mentioned, and it was forbidden to promote an unmarried person in government service. I'm going to pause here, and we will talk a little bit more about the resistance and the fall of fascism when we come back. Okay, stay tuned.